prophet of doom? Who claims that title on a Friday? You know, I mean, because we are coming from quite a strong fourth quarter, in which things were a lot better than people had expected. What are you expecting for the first quarter, and why?
So let me start by saying, you know, I don't like being the prophet of doom, but I think when you look at, you know, the high frequency data that we've been seeing for the first 3 months of the year, it becomes really difficult to be optimistic about Q1 GDP growth. So for instance, we have already seen on the production side of the economy that mining production was actually down something like 12.7%. On a quarter-on-quarter basis.
Okay, but then that was, I think, also largely driven by the protest and the gold operations as a result of the Sabania strike?
Absolutely, absolutely. You could actually see when you look at gold production that played a really big part of it. But when you look at other parts, the key parts of mining in South Africa, coal, PGMs, and iron ore, we also didn't really get much of an outperformance to offset those issues in gold.
All right.
So mining is pretty poor. Manufacturing side of things also not looking great. We're down something like 9% on quarter-on-quarter basis. So that's just the production side. And when we look at electricity production as well, for instance, that was also down 6.6%. Obviously not a surprise given the kind of load shedding that we've seen in February and in March. But it's not just there. When you look at the demand side of the economy, so your retail sales, your wholesale sales, we had some numbers out there yesterday. Retail sales down 3% in Q1. You look at wholesale sales down about 5%. You look at car sales also down by a really large number. And so when we look at all of these numbers and, you know, we try to figure out what proportion of the economy this actually is, we realize that it's actually a really big part of the economy, and it doesn't just end there. The interlinkages with the rest of the economy are really strong. So as a result, we think it's quite likely that we're going to see a really big contraction in Q1.
How big?
Minus 2.2%.
That's a really big contraction.
It is indeed. And I think what's worrying about this is that when you get a contraction this large in Q1, because you remember that, you know, institutions like the National Treasury, like the SARB, at the start of the year, they were saying, you know, a number maybe about 1.4, 1.5%. But when you get a contraction this big so early on in the year, it becomes really difficult, unless if the rebound is that big over the remainder of the year, to actually then go back to there. So we think we could actually, for the year as a whole, even fall below 1% again in 2019.
I mean, what do you think is the major driver behind that contraction? Many people would say it was Eskom, because you talk to the guys in manufacturing and lost production as a result of, you know, insufficient power supply. You talk to the guys in mining, they say the same thing. So was it Eskom, or was it even more than Eskom?
So I think Eskom played a really big role in that. And I think there was a number of companies. For instance, one major PGMs producer came out and said they actually lost about 92,000 ounces of platinum production in the first quarter alone as a result of load shedding. But I think even beyond that, you still have some structural weaknesses in the South African economy. There's sort of two key things that feature here. One is that the South African consumer, who's a really big driver of GDP, household consumption expenditure is directly 60% of South Africa's GDP. The consumer is financially constrained right now. We're not seeing employment creation, and more recently, when you look at income growth numbers, they're starting to moderate. Consumers have also had to take some big tax increases. They're paying a lot more for fuel, and all of those things are acting as really big drags on disposable income. So momentum from the consumer is really weak. But on the business side, we haven't really seen the rebound that we expected in business confidence. So the investment story is also not picking up as rapidly as we would like to see it. So you have the structural weakness, and when you have a shock like Eskom, like we've had in Q1, it really doesn't take a lot to suddenly now fall in the negative space like we think we're likely to see in Q1.
Okay, so a big change that has just happened, of course, is the election. Now you have got a president who's going to come with a mandate. You've got a little bit more certainty on that front. Are you expecting a reversal or an improvement in business confidence as a result?
We are optimistic on that front, I have to say. So although we do expect this contraction in Q1, we think we are going to see a rebound in the second quarter of the year and over the remainder of the year.
Driven by?
I think President Ramaphosa, I think, gets it. I think if he actually comes out with a cabinet that signals early on that he's very serious about his reform agenda, that may be enough to give you a bit of a boost in terms of confidence, in terms of businesses saying, you know what, the long-term story is starting to look a little bit different for South Africa. So if you get that initial bump in confidence, that may be enough to give you a bit of a lift in economic activity. And I think already what we're starting to see when we look at some of these high-frequency indicators like PMIs for April, for instance, it's clear that the fact that we haven't had load shedding continue has already given you a bit of a rebound. So I think if President Ramaphosa comes through very strongly in terms of reforming the SA economy, that may give you the confidence bounce that we need to see in the South African economy.
All right, Miyelani, two things really briefly. I mean, before we get to MPC next week, I want to talk to you about Moody's, because we had an announcement from them yesterday.
Right.
The numbers that you're projecting, and if South Africa's economy again underperforms, do we still have room from Moody's to retain our investment grade rating?
I think we have some room, but it's not a lot of room. But because the one thing that was very clear from the Moody's statement yesterday is that if South Africa's growth situation does not improve and we continue to see that undermining revenue collection, and we're not able to stabilize the expenditure side of things, and in particular deal with the Eskom problem, then the pressure on South Africa's rating will just continue to be downwards. And I worry that for the room for us to keep this investment grade rating with them is getting narrower and narrower. So it's going to be important for us to lift growth prospects and try to stabilize the situation at Eskom going forward.
And then how does the Reserve Bank, who is meeting next week, respond to this by way of interest rates? I mean, you've got a really weak economy, you've got consumers on their knees, you've got business on its knees, essentially. What do you do as a Lesejahanya?
It's a difficult position for them, and I think when one tries to read the MPC, just in terms of their own reaction function, the argument that they've been making is that South Africa's growth problem is not a monetary policy problem.
Sure.
It's a much more structural problem, like Q1, for instance, and it's an Eskom problem. You cannot solve that by cutting interest rates. And what they're deciding to focus on is trying to anchor inflation expectations, because that, over the medium to longer term, is actually supportive to economic growth. So I think it's quite likely that next week they're going to come out and make similar comments. But I think the baseline case for us is that they're probably going to keep interest rates on hold.
Okay.